Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jane Lute. I am the former Deputy Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security. I currently serve as a Special Advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I'm a member of the Atlantic Council Board. And on behalf of the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative, which is housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 10th Annual Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge in Washington, D.C. Today, we're joined by 39 teams for this competition, making it our largest virtual competition ever. We're joined by competitors representing universities from across 14 states, as well as Israel and Malawi. We're so thrilled that each of you can be joining us today and be part of this competition. And of course, we wish we could convene in person, but we're still grateful to be able to hold this competition amidst one of the most challenging times in living memory. We're delighted to be joined by so many committed competitors, coaches, and judges during this unprecedented time, underscoring the importance of collaboration on national security, cybersecurity, and resilience. We're confronting two very, very different crises. COVID-19, which continues to shape nearly every aspect of our lives, exposing serious and staggering vulnerabilities in both our systems and in our societies. And in Ukraine, the events unfolding there remind us of the very real and human consequences of our efforts to achieve a peaceful world, and in the importance and consequences of statecraft. In their very different ways, both of these crises underscore the promise and peril of our increasingly interconnected world. And this is why we need your help, your vision, your passion, expertise, creativity for the way we work, the way we live, the way we stay connected. All of this relies on networks. And that's why the Atlantic Council created the Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge, to prepare a new generation of leaders to take on these issues and build a safer future for us all. The Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council works to develop sustainable and nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States. I had the privilege of working for General Scowcroft earlier in my career, and I can tell you he was a giant for many of us who knew him, for all of us who knew him. And this week we lost another giant, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, also an active member of the Atlantic Council, and a committed light and voice for bipartisanship and for decisive American leadership in the world. The Cyber Statecraft Initiative has worked to anticipate future threats, and it also is designed to provide practical, innovative, and relevant solutions to the challenges that we face in cyberspace. Cybersecurity has evolved over the years and encompasses issues such as public safety, election integrity, national security, and political risk. And so too has the Cyber 912 series. Our alumni now can be found across government and industry and around the world. And locally, Cyber 912 has already helped build and develop our cyber workforce ecosystem and help drive home the need to emphasize international collaboration around cyber and greater security in cyberspace. Diversity has also been a fundamental element of the Cyber 912 series. As we foster the next generation of multidisciplinary leaders, we champion diversity in many forms, including perspective, skill set, geographic location, gender identity, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and more. In 2020, the Cyber Statecraft Initiative established the Next Gen Fund in an effort to make Cyber 912 more accessible to underrepresented students and nation professionals in the cybersecurity community. The Next Gen Fund builds on Cyber 912's legacy as a unique global competition and its history of innovation to bring the best and the brightest into the cyber workforce of the future. Before we begin, I want to say thank you, a very big thank you, to our organizing team, to the coaches, competitors, and to our judges. You've all taken time out of your busy schedules to join us and to lend your time and expertise to make this competition possible. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Chris Inglis. Chris serves as the first National Cyber Director, advising the President of the United States on cybersecurity. Prior to this role, Chris served as Distinguished Visiting Professor for Cybersecurity Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy, beat Navy, and as Professor for Cybersecurity Studies as well. He also served as a commissioner on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Chris has had an extensive career in government, serving at NSA for 28 years and over 30 years in both the U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard as a C-130 pilot, beat Air Force. As the first National Cyber Director, Chris's office is promoting cyber policy coherence across the federal enterprise and driving collaboration with the private sector. The Office of the National Cyber Director was established at a time when small, under-resourced entities are shouldering immense levels of cyber risk, and it highlights the need for a new social contract for the digital age that meaningfully brings together public and private sectors. I can tell you that over the course of your career, you will meet many people who are high speed, who are competent, who are experienced, who are impressive, credentialed, and even insightful and creative. But you will rarely meet people who are all of these things, as well as kind, thoughtful, selfless, and someone who makes everyone better, and someone who puts the nation first. And it's been my privilege to work with Chris at various times over the course of my career, and I can't think of anyone better to hold the vital position that he does in our government. Our country really is well served with his presence and effort, and I hand it over to him with my thanks for his service. Chris.
Jane, thank you very much. That is a warm and overly generous welcome. And I will remember part of that career serving alongside you as you were the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. Can recall your vision quite clearly about what we didn't know the name in the day, but what the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency might become. I think it's become that. I think that it has become a juggernaut that delivers and then some on all of the promise that you held out for it. So thank you for your leadership early and often. And with reflection on perhaps your sports affiliations, I must say that I do root for Navy on every day except one, and Army on every day except one. Go Air Force. Today, what I'm going to do is to kind of do a talk on three different tracks. First, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the social contract that you mentioned, Jane. I would then like to kind of move on and perhaps for the participants in the exercise, give some anecdotes, both from my personal experience and from this exercise that I've seen in the past about what perhaps works well, what might not work well in the larger context of cyber, but certainly in the context of this exercise. And then perhaps put that all in a larger context to say, so what comes next for the participants and for us, kind of a wrap up of sorts. I begin by saying that this kind of Cyber 912 is one of my favorite exercises. Why is that? Because my own sense of what cyber is, cyber the noun, is it of course has a lot of technology in it. That's the visible thing, that's often the pacing thing. But we have to imagine that cyber is more than that, because people are not merely served by cyberspace, they're in it. The choices they make implicate cyber fortunes or perhaps cyber disasters. The choices that they make every day drive how cyberspace actually behaves. They're on the front lines of cyberspace. But I think more importantly, and perhaps sometimes less obviously, there's a third piece of cyberspace, which I would describe as doctrine, which may in plainer terms be described as roles and responsibilities. Do we know who is responsible for what? Have we tied all those roles together in a way that it makes sense? Or do we presume that somebody's defending something when nobody is defending something? Do we assume that something's happening upstream in the pipeline we happen to be in, or perhaps in the larger context of the network we might be using? If we don't get that doctrine right, then no amount of trained people and no amount of good technology is going to save us from ourselves. And I would say that that noun of cyberspace, technology and people and doctrine, is always practiced in the presence of adversaries. Now, that adversary might sometimes be nature, a storm sweeping up the East Coast. It might sometimes be human error, complacency, sometimes willful errors, just taking shortcuts. But increasingly, those adversaries are active persons or organizations or nation states who take it upon themselves to hold us at risk in and through cyberspace. If that's true, we then need to consider it from the perspective of those adversaries. When an adversary thinks about cyberspace, they look back at us using cyberspace, digital infrastructure, And they think about taking advantage of weaknesses in us in the reverse order that I mentioned. They first consider the doctrine. Is our doctrine shored up? Kind of, is it certainly one thing that would cause them some difficulty? If that's squared away on our part, then they would think about whether they can find and take advantage of a person, people who perhaps are not on their front feet and they're not thinking their way through how to participate in their own defense. And if necessary, they'll then turn to the third dimension of cyberspace, which is, can I find one of those vaunted zero-day vulnerabilities or some technical flaw in the architecture and go after that? But we've made it too easy for them to come after us because we don't have the right doctrine and because we don't have people upskilled to serve their role. We made it so easy for them that, frankly, very seldom is technology the issue. All of that, I think, if we kind of get our arms around that, leads us to consider what we describe as a new social contract. Frankly, what that equates to is we have to reconsider what we owe each other. Do all of us have a role to play in this? Do individuals have a role to play in their own defense? Do organizations have a role to play that heretofore they might have presumed was somebody else's problem? Does the government have a greater role to play that heretofore it would have thought is simply a private sector issue? And do we really understand who is the supported organization and who's the supporting organization? There's never been a moment like this where in the national security dimension that we found the government essentially trying to figure out how it supports the private sector, which is on the front lines, as opposed to the other way around. I'll just leave you in this doctrinal component by saying Jeff Moss, one of my favorite thought leaders in this space, he's the person who essentially has DEF CON, Black Hat, and other accomplishments to his name, often in a conversation like this asks a question, which is, why do race cars have bigger brakes? It's a pretty straightforward question, causes me to pause for a second, and he immediately answers, they have bigger brakes so that they can go faster. We have to ask the same question about cyber. Why do we have cyber? Not for its own sake. We have cyber so that we can achieve the aspirations we have about what we want to do with digital infrastructure. That leads us to consider what we have to do to guarantee that, to make sure that we follow through. We build those bigger brakes in cyberspace, not for their own sake, not to have bragging rights about bigger brakes in cyberspace, but so that individuals, organizations, governments can do what they want in and through that space. The doctrine, then, if we get our arms around that, begins to look something like this. If we want those bigger brakes, that probably equates in cyberspace to greater resilience. How do we build resilience in, by design, to the technology, to the people, and to the doctrine? Get the roles and responsibilities right, get people kind of up to the game, and of course, bend technology to those two purposes. But there's something more important, because if we do that, if we make that sufficiently resilient that it might be then defended, we have to actually defend it. And the nature of that defense is very, very important. It has to be a collaborative defense as opposed to a division of effort defense. And the reason I say that is if you have a division of effort defense, in many regards, that's an agreement not to collaborate. What you essentially devolve to is that every person, organization, sector defends itself based upon what it knows in its area of influence, using what authorities it has in that area of influence, using only perhaps the tools that it has in that area of influence. That's a recipe for disaster because an adversary can pick us off one at a time. There are no actual boundaries between many of us in cyberspace that we might imagine exist in physical space. Jurisdictions are often described on physical space, but cyberspace runs roughshod over that. I'm kind of wrapping all that up. I think that the new proposal for a social contract would be summarized in one line, which is, why don't we propose that if you're a transgressor in this space, you have to beat all of us to beat one of us. That would be new. That would be different. That would be something that we've not really done before. That transcends. That's way different than simply sharing information. That's way different than accessing common databases. That's essentially forming dots together, discovering things together that no one of us could have discovered alone, which then puts us in a position where we can collaborate in its mitigation. What do we get for that? Well, I think it might be obvious, but let's just look over our shoulder and see where we've been for the last 2 years. The miraculous development of COVID vaccines comes from having made significant investments in technology, information sharing, collaboration in the medical sector for years before that. The relationships, the ability to essentially bend technology to society's purpose was realized in a profoundly valuable way in literally months when previously it might have taken years, 3 to 7 years to develop a vaccine of consequence. We did it literally in months and then deployed that. And this is not the first time we've experienced technology getting ahead of policy. We've seen technology ahead of policy in the transportation era, well before there were seatbelts in cars or air safety bags. We've seen technology get ahead of policy in the manufacturing sector before we actually cared about clean water, clean air. And of course, we've seen that to some degree in the medical or therapeutics industry, when we used to have quack therapies that were available to people without any regulation or specification about what good looked like. In each of those cases, we've reset this so that we get policy ahead of the technology. It's now a requirement to have seatbelts and air safety bags. It's a requirement to have clean air and clean water. It's a requirement to have pure food and drugs. More importantly, it's an expectation. Society has essentially decided that that's what we want to do to achieve our aspirations with transportation, with manufacturing, with medicine. We need to do the same thing in and through cyberspace. And if we do that, the larger promise then for us is we'll seize the initiative from adversaries. I don't want to obsess about threats in this space. I want to be mindful of them, but what I really want to focus on is getting on with what I wanted cyberspace, the internet plus, to do for us in the first place. Stop being reactive, stop essentially using operational activities to make the difference. It should be that we make these investments in what we would describe in the industry as the capital expenditure phase, security by design. How do we get there from here? It's both obvious and perhaps not so obvious. Both sides of the private-public sector, for example, have to give some further consideration about what their responsibilities are. As I mentioned earlier, the private sector is the supported organization. It needs, however, to lead by example. It needs to kind of invest, whether it's in supply chains, think open source software, or whether it's doing those basic foundational things in small architectures that then become big architectures. The private sector needs to step out and make this an investment priority. At the same time, the government needs to do something similar, if not a bit more, because the government has a greater responsibility, both to lead by example, but to use its unique instruments of power, its convening power, its legal instruments of power, its military instruments of power, its diplomatic instruments of power for the benefit of the private sector in a proactive way, such that we're joined up, coherent, and delivering those services to the private sector in ways that heretofore we have not. Right? We both have responsibilities to shore up a common shared enterprise known as cyberspace. So I think if we do that, then the social contract then becomes real. Let me move on to perhaps the second part of my talk. I'm going to give a couple of anecdotes that perhaps might at once be humorous, but looking over our shoulder, instructive about what perhaps the lesson taken should be. I can still remember quite clearly a moment when I was in the private sector on a board when somebody came in from an IT shop, an information technology shop, to brief the board. And essentially the briefing went something like this. I need $10 million to do multi-factor authentication so I can prevent cross-site scripting so that we can then make sure that cyber is in the right place within this company. There wasn't a person in the room who wasn't looking for a door or trying to create one at that moment in time. Why? Because no one had any earthly idea what the person was actually speaking about. It was actually a quite legitimate request, but because the person had not spoken the language of the audience and put it in the context of the audience, which had read the business plan, but hadn't perhaps read all the details of the IT plan that would support that, no one knew quite what to say. No one knew what questions to ask or how perhaps to make some kind of inroads to, is it $10 million, $9 million, or is there some alternative strategy? What's the lesson? Speak the language of your audience. Understand the context of your audience. A better briefing would have been, hey, I read the business plan. I know we want to do business in some really interesting, sketchy places. There are folks there who kind of try to get on our networks who aren't what they seem to be. If you give me some money, maybe $10 million, I can help us acquire the $20 million of revenue that you're looking for by essentially guaranteeing you that when somebody comes into our network, that they have to be identified as who they really are, and further, that they can't then move around in the network abusing their privilege. That's a conversation most people can have. I can remember another moment when I was kind of in a private sector organization where there was something that actually ravaged the world. I think WannaCry, not Petya, but one of those grand sweeping vulnerabilities that was taken advantage of by an adversary. And it turns out that in that particular situation, 98% of our global apparatus had been patched and actually did just fine. But 2% had not been patched and essentially fell hard, right? Essentially went down hard. And when we took a hard look at that, it turned out that the 2% were the controllers that essentially directed the activities of the 98%. It was somewhat apparent that we had failed to defend the most important part of the system. When we asked about that and said, why did you not defend? Why did you not patch that 2%? The answer from the IT shop was, well, because the ops people, the operations teams, who are a little bit concerned about patching, not quite knowing what it is, not understanding the value that it brings to the table, said, don't patch the 2% until you prove that the 98% doesn't have any secondary consequences. Now, what clearly was obvious there was that there were persons in that organization authorized to take risk, the ops people, and there were persons who were expected to then mitigate that risk, the IT shop. And because those roles were misaligned, right, it turns out that you can't actually reconcile that in the activity that the adversary then chooses to kind of put upon you, because they go first. They take advantage of that flaw in your doctrine before you have a chance to shore it up. What's the lesson there? Align the roles. If there are persons authorized to take risk, make sure that one and the same persons are committed and accountable to understand and mitigate that risk. What I found most interesting in that example is when we did that, made the ops teams accountable for cyber risk. One of the first questions from them, what is patching and how does one do that? It essentially begins to shore up what otherwise would be some dissonance between the IT teams and the ops teams. So what does good look like in the briefings that you're going to give during the course of this exercise? Well, first, I think when you give your briefings, you need to actually start with the end in mind. What is it you're trying to deliver? What is it you're trying to accomplish? What are your recommendations trying to ensure gets done? I've seen many impressive football campaigns that go 99 yards in a short period of time or a long period of time. But unless you go that last 3 feet, unless you cross that goal line, all of that is for naught. So you need to make sure you keep that end goal in mind, describe that up front, and make sure that every piece of your presentation supports that. Make sure that you understand that communications are measured on receipt, not on sent. If the language you use is not the language that's shared or enjoyed by your audience, then you may have the most brilliant concept ever kind of described to a panel of interest, but it's going to fall flat on its feet because they don't know what you're talking about. Remember that cyber is more than technology. It is technology, it's people, it's doctrine practiced in the presence of an adversary. Think about all the dimensions of that. Think perhaps about what the proper ordering of those dimensions is. Describe a situation or a solution that addresses all of those. If you solve one of those dimensions, but not the other two, you've actually wasted some time and effort. Think of campaigns, not salvos, right? When you think about the solution, understand that your first kind of point of approach, your first point of attack, if you want to use that term, perhaps is going to be understood and addressed by the adversary. And you need to think about what you're going to do in phase 2, in phase 3, and phase 4. You need to be able to measure what results you've actually accrued with your first set of activities, understand whether they made the difference intended, and then reapproach the problem and then have something more to do. Don't leave any loose ends in that regard. And finally, when you're all done, make sure that you give some pause and time for the panel to ask you questions, and be prepared. Have the branches and sequels in your mind so that you can answer those questions and do what's necessary in that regard. Let me wrap up a little bit. So where do you go when Cyber 912 is done? Well, of course, back to your various academic pursuits, your professional pursuits. But my hope is that you leave, right, Cyber 912, and my confidence is you leave Cyber 912 with a better understanding of what doctrine is necessary in this space, what doctrine would work in this space. More important, that kind of beyond that, you leave with some relationships to one another, relationships perhaps to kind of persons, parties, organizations that heretofore you might not have thought strongly about. Because I will tell you at the end of the day, cyber is not a vertical, it's a horizontal. It's about melding all of the various disciplines, diverse people, diverse organizations, diverse authorities, right? You know, it's a real Star Wars bar. It's about putting all those together in a way that we can make it such that if you're a transgressor in this space, again, you have to beat all of us to beat one of us. If we get that doctrine right, then I think that we'll be in a position where we can actually bend the needle. We can have a transformative effect. Let me then just close with one particular thing, which is that cyber at the end of the day, it's about technology, people, and doctrine. 2/3 of it, and perhaps the most important 2/3 of it, is really about people. There are people who have cyber or IT in their job title, and we need to have more of those, and they need to be expert in what they do. but many of you might not wind up in those jobs. I would still say that every profession needs to know something more about cyber than they know today, and you all will take that to the various trades, occupations that you then pursue. Even lawyers need some additional cyber training. Even computer scientists need some additional cyber training. And so hopefully we populate all of those other trades and professions with some degree of cyber understanding. But at the end of the day, everyone needs to know more about cyber than they get just by being in its presence. Most of us, born and raised in the presence of this technology, are not digital natives, we're app natives. We don't have enough understanding about what happens when we click on a link to make the right choice about whether we should or should not click on that link. We don't know the moral equivalent of how to cross a cyber street as much as we do to cross a busy city street or to manage a hot stove. So we need to make sure that we understand enough about that in every seat that occupies a position in cyberspace to ensure that we are up to the game as we participate in our own defense. Clearly, you're part of the solution. Your work through this exercise will help hone our sense of doctrine. We'll all take lessons from that. But your experiences that you then take to the various things you do will filtrate into all of those activities in a way that's essential to ensure that we up our game. Cybersecurity operations centers need you, but so does every workforce kind of job site across this country and all of those represented in this activity. And finally, I just want to say thank you to the Atlantic Council for sponsoring this. Again, this is one of my very favorite exercises, so much so that we've contributed some number of the staff from the Office of the National Cyber Director to be judges. You may come across them. If you do, you might want to ask them about some job opportunities here. We're building out and we're hiring at the moment. But I leave you with this. I wish you all the best because your success will become our success. And I hope that the next few days are a very enjoyable, professionally rewarding opportunity for you. I'd say good luck to us as we make our way forward.
Excellent. Director Inglis, thank you for that. It's an interesting trifecta, this notion of communication is key, which I think we teach to all the teams. Anticipation is critical as you're thinking through this multi-part scenario, but I really love that emphasis on compassion. The reason we're here, the reason we use these technologies, the things that we're doing are not simply because of the technologies, not for sake of them, but to empower the creativity, the sustainment, the productivity, the novelty that technology brings to our society. So it's a useful thing for the competitors to remember as you're moving through this competition and throughout your work. With that, let me say thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this morning. Competitors and coaches, please stay here for your briefing. Judges, please go to your briefing room. It should be a calendar invite. And with that, to brief the competitors and the coaches, let me please introduce the incomparable Safa Shawan Edwards.